Dad said get out on Christmas Eve. He didn't know what I'd already done. My dad always said Christmas was for family. He said it every year. Standing at the head of the table, glass raised, that wide smile on his face like he was auditioning for a holiday commercial. Family first, always. I believed him for 31 years. I stopped believing him on December 24th, the night he looked me in the eye, pointed at the front door, and told me to get out of a house that was supposed to be mine too. But here's the thing about that night. By the time he said those words, I had already made sure they'd cost him everything. Let me take you back to where this actually started. Not Christmas Eve, not even that year. It started the day my mom died. She passed in March, quietly, the way she did everything. Lung cancer. 8 months from diagnosis to gone. I was 29. I moved back home for those 8 months to take care of her. Because my dad couldn't handle it. Wouldn't handle it. He'd disappear for hours. Said he was running errands, said he needed air. Said she wouldn't want him sitting there watching her fade. I was the one sitting there. Every single day. I cooked her meals. I drove her to chemo. I held her hand at 3 a.m. when the pain got bad and she didn't want to wake anyone. I learned which medications helped and which ones made her nauseous. And I kept a notebook, actual handwritten notebook, with every doctor's name, every number, every appointment, every dosage. Because someone had to. My dad showed up when it was convenient. When she was having a good day. When there were other people around to see him being a devoted husband. When it was just the two of them. He found reasons to leave. Mom passed on a Tuesday morning. I was holding her hand. He was not in the room. He was downstairs making coffee when it happened. And by the time he came up, it was already over. I never said anything about that, not once. 3 weeks later, he introduced us to Diane. I want to be fair. I genuinely tried to be fair. I told myself grief does strange things to people. I told myself my dad was a man who didn't know how to be alone, who had been with my mom since he was 22 years old, and maybe the silence in that house after she was gone was something he genuinely couldn't survive. I told myself Diane was a distraction, a coping mechanism, something temporary that would fade once the rawness faded. I was civil for 8 months. I came to dinners when I was invited. I shook Diane's hand. I answered her questions about my job, my apartment, my life, the polite, surface-level questions she asked with that practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. I said thank you when she cooked. I did not comment on the fact that she used my mom's good dishes on a random Tuesday like they were nothing special. Then the comments started. Small ones at first. The living room feels a little heavy, don't you think? All these dark curtains. Then bigger ones. I think your dad needs to stop going to the cemetery every week. It's keeping him stuck. Then one Sunday I came over and the photos were gone. Not moved. Not rearranged. Gone. My mom's face. Her smile at my college graduation. Her and my dad on their honeymoon in Maine. Her holding me as a newborn, all of it. In a cardboard box in the garage. Sitting between old cans of paint and a broken leaf. Blower like she was just another thing to be sorted through and set aside. I found the box by accident. I wasn't supposed to see it. My dad had been careful about that. I didn't say anything. I carried the box to my car, drove home, and sat in my apartment for 2 hours in the dark. Then I called Carol. Carol was my mom's lawyer. She'd handled my mom's estate. Had known her for nearly 20 years. Since before I was in high school. When I called, I didn't even get through my first sentence before Carol said, "Quietly, I've been expecting to hear from you." She walked me through everything my mom had set up. The house my dad had lived in for 34 years where I grew up. Where my mom had tended every garden and painted every wall and chosen every piece of furniture. Had been purchased using money from my mom's family, her parents' savings, her inheritance. And when they'd bought it together, my mom had insisted her name be on the deed. My dad's name was there too, but so was hers. And under the terms of her will, updated quietly in her final weeks, when she was still sharp, still thinking clearly, still protecting the people she loved even while she was dying. The house passed to me upon her death. My dad retained the right to live there. 2 years rent-free, on the condition that the property was maintained and no significant changes were made. Without my written consent. The contractor Diane had already booked for January. The full kitchen renovation, the master bedroom expansion, the removal of the garden my mom had planted herself over 15 years. All of it counted as significant changes. Carol had the paperwork ready. All I had to do was say the word. I told her to hold it. I told her I wanted to wait. Maybe some part of me still believed my dad would wake up, that he'd look around at what was happening and choose differently, that one morning he'd go to the garage for something and see that box with her face on it and feel the full weight of what he'd done. I gave him until Christmas. I arrived at 4 o'clock on Christmas Eve. The house smelled like Diane's candles, vanilla and cedar. Nothing like the cinnamon my mom always used. There were new throw pillows on the couch my mom had picked out. A new wreath on the door. Little changes, each one small enough to dismiss on its own. But together they added up to something that no longer looked like home. Diane was in the kitchen acting like she'd always been there. My dad was in his chair with his second glass of wine, watching football, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. I sat through dinner. I ate the food and I answered questions, and I made the appropriate noises at the appropriate times. My dad told a story about work. Diane laughed too loudly. Outside it started to snow, light at first, then heavier. The quiet kind of Christmas Eve snow my mom always loved. She used to stand at that window and just watch it. I looked at the window and she wasn't there, and Diane was refilling my dad's glass, and I made a decision. I mentioned casually that I'd spoken to Carol recently. The table went quiet. Not dramatically, just a half-second pause, a slight shift. The way a room changes when someone says something that lands differently than it sounds. My dad looked at me. He knew who Carol was. He suggested we talk privately. We went to the living room, the room where my mom's photos used to be, where the walls were now bare except for one of Diane's abstract prints that looked like it came from a hotel lobby, and my dad closed the door and turned around, and the warmth was gone from his face completely. He told me whatever I was thinking I needed to stop, that he had rights, that this was his home, that he had lived here for 34 years, that he had given up enough and lost enough, and he deserved to move forward with his life. Without his own son making it harder, he said I was being selfish. He said my mom would be ashamed of how I was acting. I looked at him for a long moment. This man I had watched disappear while she was dying. This man who had boxed up her face and put it next to paint cans. This man standing in her living room with another woman's art on the walls, telling me she would be ashamed of me. I said, "Ma," very quietly, and I don't think she would be. And my dad pointed at the door and told me to get out. On Christmas Eve, in the house my mother left to me, I picked up my jacket. I picked up my keys. I walked to the front door and I put my hand on the knob and I turned around one more time. I said, "It's not your house, Dad. It hasn't been since March. Carol's been waiting on my call. I'm making it tomorrow." I opened the door and walked out into the snow. December 27th, first business day after Christmas. Carol filed the paperwork before noon. She was efficient and thorough, and she had clearly been ready for this moment for some time. The documentation was airtight. My mom had made absolutely certain of that. Every clause, every condition, every protection had been put in place by a woman who loved her family enough to plan for the worst even, while she was facing it herself. My dad received formal notification on January 3rd. He had 90 days to make arrangements. He called me that same night. The anger was gone. He didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't try to negotiate. He sounded hollowed out, like a man who had stepped through a door, expecting one thing, and found the floor wasn't there. He asked me if I was really doing this. I told him I didn't want to. I told him I had spent months, 8 months of watching her die, and then 8 more months of watching him erase her, hoping I wouldn't have to. I told him there were 100 moments when he could have chosen differently, when he could have slowed down, when he could have looked at that box in the garage and put the photos back on the wall. He was quiet for a long time. Then he started talking. Really talking, and not the controlled, managed version of himself I'd been getting for a year. He said he knew he'd handled everything wrong. He said being in that house, without her, was something he couldn't describe, that every room held something he couldn't look at, and Diane made it possible to not look. He said he knew that wasn't fair to me. He knew it wasn't fair to her memory. He just didn't know how else to keep moving. I listened to all of it. When he finished, I said, "I hear you, Dad, I do. But I'm not the one you hurt most. You put her in a box in the garage. 8 months after she died, while she was still in the ground." He didn't say anything after that. We stayed on the phone in silence for almost a minute. Then he said goodnight and hung up. He and Diane moved into an apartment in February. It was on the 3rd floor of a building across town. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a parking lot view. Nothing like what they'd had. I heard through my aunt that Diane had not taken the news gracefully. That the renovation plans, the future she'd been quietly designing in her head, had dissolved, and she'd made sure my dad knew exactly how she felt about that. I moved back into the house in March, almost exactly 1 year after my mom died. I unpacked slowly. I took my time with every room, not rushing, not trying to make it feel like something it wasn't. I let it just be what it was. Her house. My house now. The same walls, the same floors. The same light through the kitchen window in the morning that she'd always loved. I unpacked her photos last. I hung them back where they'd always been. Same walls. Same positions, same faces looking out at the same rooms. Her at my graduation. Her and my dad on their honeymoon. Her holding me as a newborn. Exhausted and smiling in that way that only mothers smile. Then I sat down on the couch, her couch. The one Diane had put new pillows on. The pillows long since gone. And I looked at her face and I talked to her for a while. I told her the house was okay. That the garden needed some work, but I was going to figure it out. That the kitchen still smelled like itself underneath everything else. I told her I missed her every single day. That there wasn't a morning I didn't reach for the phone to call her before remembering. And I told her, because I think she already knew, that I'd made sure no one could take what she built and treat it like it was nothing. She planned for this. In her final weeks, when she was exhausted and in pain and running out of time, she sat down with Carol and made sure. That's who she was. That's who she'll always be. Some things are worth protecting, even when it costs you. Even when the person you're protecting them from is someone you love. Especially then.